Professor Stephen Hawking takes the stage to give a lecture about time to a packed auditorium. In the audience is a curious mix of both physicists and devoted fans.
Can you hear me?
He's so famous. Everyone, when you think of physics, you automatically think of Stephen Hawking.
What he says, they're like pearls that drop now because everyone's on the edge of their seat waiting to see what this great mind is going to share with us again.
His book, A Brief History of Time, was a record-breaking bestseller. It has made him the greatest science superstar since Albert Einstein.
The possibility to see somebody like Einstein speak, I don't think anybody would pass up. He is the #1 celebrity physicist for me.
People like the idea of him being the great mind in the crippled body, and this image of him speaking some kind of ultimate truth.
And I think Stephen, because of his condition, not his fault of course, but because of his condition, he is treated rather in this way, as some kind of oracle.
All over the world, people want a hero of science, like Einstein was. My ambition was to understand the universe, not to be famous.
But is Hawking's status as the greatest mind since Einstein really just a product of hype and public sympathy? What actually lies behind this image of modern-day genius?
People think of Hawking as having been created the way he is today. He wasn't. He was normal at first.
Stephen William Hawking was born on the 8th of January 1942 in Oxford. The eldest child of middle-class educated parents, he grew up in an unconventional and intellectual family.
He was extremely talkative as a child. In fact, he never stopped. But he didn't learn to read very early. I think because I told him stories, his father read him stories, so he didn't really see any need. His sisters were much quicker at reading than he was, and I don't think he would have passed all these tests that people pass, because we were never really very conscious of that sort of thing in our household.
His father, Dr. Frank Hawking, was a medical scientist and travelled the world researching tropical diseases. He encouraged his son's curiosity about the world around him.
It wasn't very long before he and his father were lying on the grass in the garden, looking up through a rather old-fashioned telescope at the stars and the moon. His father was very inspiring in a lot of ways, and he just led him into that sort of thing. But I don't think he needed much leading. It was just natural to him.
By the age of 10, Hawking already knew he wanted to be a scientist and find out how the universe worked. His curiosity extended to his childhood hobbies. He liked designing complicated Meccano models for him and his friends to build. He later said they were an early exercise in figuring out how things worked and how to control them. While Hawking relished the challenge of working things out for himself, conventional lessons left him cold. He went to a minor private school in St. Albans, where at first it was his appearance rather than his performance that made him stand out.
Well, he was a small, untidy boy.
Yes, and with a somewhat large and ungainly head in proportion to the rest, I suppose. And he did quite often look gangling, as if his joints weren't quite tightly connected, so he would sort of flop about a bit.
His speech was called by somebody Hawkingese because it did rather resemble his father's rapid machine gun delivery combined with a bit of a stutter.
I think in terms of ordinary academic achievement at school, he wasn't regarded as particularly clever and never did very well in exams. All right, but not very well.
For one thing, his handwriting was execrable. And for another thing, he just is not and was not competitive. I remember once when I think almost his first year at St Albans School, he was pretty near the bottom of the group. He was in the 8th stream. And I said, can't you do a bit better than that? And he said, well, some other people have done worse. He really did not care.
But when he was interested, Hawking worked hard. At the age of just 16, he and his school friends designed and built a computer.
It worked. If you asked it the right questions, it gave you the right answers. It was made out of all sorts of spare parts from old machines and toasters and things like this.
Inevitably, Hawking's innate abilities eventually pulled him to the top of the class. His final report was glowing. Following in his father's footsteps, he applied to University College, Oxford. He went up in 1959, aged just 17, to read physics and mathematics. But study was the last thing on his mind. Most of the people in his year were older than him, having done national service. The boyish Hawking seemed to have some catching up to do.
My first memory of really talking to Stephen was when Gordon Berry, another of the physicists in my year, and I went to find Stephen to catch some coffee from him after dinner. And Stephen was sitting there with a crate of beer, drinking his way through it. At the time, of course, he was only 17. He couldn't even go into a pub legally. And we had a very pleasant evening with him.
What he looked like, most of the time he was up really, was rather messy, untidy, a bit not really clean, though he may have been. But this is the impression he gave, hair too long and that sort of thing. I met him in college at parties. And, of course, he liked drinking, and I always used to go and talk to Stephen at the beginning of parties, because it was better value, really, to do so.
Hawking's social life wasn't confined to drinking. He was a member of his college rowing club, coxing the second eight. His aggressive, competitive style made him a popular member of the team and always worth watching.
I remember running along the towpath because he was a very exciting cox, a very lively figure. Being in the boat club helped him a great deal because he was respected for his ability as a cox, a member of the gang, as 'twere. Stephen never really did very much in the way of work. It was an era in which a number of people didn't do a great deal of work, but Stephen was outstanding in not doing anything. And got away with it because, of course, he was so intelligent.
I once calculated that I did about 1,000 hours work in the 3 years I was at Oxford. An average of an hour a day. I am not proud of this lack of work. I am just describing my attitude at the time.
Hawking's laid-back attitude masked his formidable intellect. His fellow students got their first inkling of this when they were all set some particularly difficult coursework.
It was chapter 10 of Bleeny and Bleeny, which was a chapter on waves. And Richard and I, working together, managed to do one whole question. We'd spent all week on it. Stephen hadn't even looked at them.
With only a few hours to go before the deadline, Hawking sat down at his desk and looked at the questions for the first time.
Down came Stephen. And so I said, well, Hawking, how many have you managed to do then? Because there were 12 questions there. And he said, well, he said, I only had time to do the first 10. And so we all started laughing. And he just looked at us quizzically. And we realised that he had actually done the first 10 questions. And I think at that point, we realised that it wasn't just that we weren't in the same street as Stephen, we weren't on the same planet.
Popular, active, and effortlessly brilliant, Hawking appeared to be living a charmed life. He left Oxford with a first-class degree and moved to Cambridge to do a PhD in cosmology. To the outside world he seemed unstoppable and his future looked brilliant. But things were not quite as rosy as they appeared.
He came back at Christmas and it was a very cold year. And we normally went skating on the lake at St Albans. So we went skating on the lake at St Albans, and he fell down and couldn't get up. So we went and had coffee, and then he told me, which he hadn't, he had been aware of this coming on, but he didn't know what it was, of course, but he hadn't passed it on, and we didn't know.
Hawking then revealed to his mother that for months he'd been having problems with his coordination. He'd had trouble tying his shoelaces and walking, and once he'd fallen down a flight of stairs and struck his head so badly that he'd temporarily lost his memory. It was clear he should go for tests.
Stephen walked in out of the blue, and so we agreed to have lunch together, and he bought some drinks, put them down on the table, and spilt the beer. Oh, God, I said, drunk again. That it's only 12:30. And then he told me that he'd just come out of hospital where he'd had a whole series of tests. And they told him that he had motor neurone disease, which I had never heard of at the time, and explained to him that he would gradually lose the use of his entire body, that his brain would remain fully working, but that at some stage he would be unable to communicate with the world outside. And that eventually only his heart and his lungs would be working, and he would be essentially trapped inside this body.
It was a great shock to be diagnosed with motor neuron disease. Why should this happen to me? It wasn't fair. But then I realized life wasn't fair. I saw the boy in the next bed in hospital die of leukemia. Clearly, I was better off than him.
Though he put on a brave face, Hawking's world was shattered. Ever since he was a boy, lying in the grass with his father looking up at the sky, he'd wanted to be a scientist. Now, just as he was starting a whole new chapter of his life at Cambridge, he was told he had just 2 years to live.
That was a dreadful year. I was very depressed. But I think he is a fighter, and I think that aspect came up pretty quickly.
I think the time when I realised how tenacious he could be was at the time that he had to start to use a walking stick, and he started to fall at that stage fairly regularly. Sometimes he fell and didn't hurt himself. Other times he would fall and hurt himself quite badly, and most people would have gone home at least and maybe to hospital, but Stephen would continue.
But Hawking was no longer struggling alone. He had fallen in love with a 20-year-old language student from St Albans, Jane Wilde. They announced their engagement in October 1964.
Both families were really thinking it might die a natural death, because they were both very young, and Stephen had been given 2 years to live, and she was very young to be taking on anything like that. So everybody tried to discourage her, but she was not to be discouraged. We didn't really quite realise, how firm it was, but it was. Hawking's
form of motor neurone disease was rare and little understood. After only a few months, to the doctor's surprise, its progress slowed. Although he still faced an early death, for Stephen it was a glimmer of hope.
I don't see that it's a coincidence that he did really do very little work until this point. When Stephen was told that he probably only had a very short time to live, I think he was determined that he would leave behind him something of real value, and that was what spurred him on to start working.
My initial reaction to learning I had an incurable condition was that it wasn't worth doing any work, because I wouldn't finish my PhD. But then my condition began to develop less rapidly, and my research took off.
Hawking was only 21 when he was told he had a rare form of motor neurone disease. Not knowing how long he had to live, he was determined to make his mark in his chosen field, cosmology. For his PhD research, he turned to the origins of the universe. This would lead to one of the most brilliant pieces of work he would ever do. In theoretical physics, scientists use equations to build mathematical models that describe what they believe is happening in our universe. Hawking became interested in the work of Roger Penrose, a mathematician who'd been calculating what happens at the heart of a black hole.
What Roger said was that anything that falls into a black hole has to go to a singularity, which is just a point in the middle. Everything has to hit this singularity. If Einstein's general theory of relativity is right, then the singularity is where everything is crushed out of existence and disappears from our universe as far as we know. What Hawking did was to show that our universe, which we know is expanding, must have come from a singularity, and it must move outwards, initially very uniformly, but then as time passes, interesting things like galaxies begin to appear and form out of the matter that's coming out from the singularity.
Hawking showed the Big Bang at the beginning of time was like the creation of a black hole in reverse.
Stephen was certainly an original thinker, I mean, that's clear, and was able to take my argument and, in a sense, turn it round in time. So the black hole singularities, if you like, are singularities in the future. That's the end of time in the future. And the Big Bang is the beginning of time. There has to be a beginning, if you like. And in the black holes, there has to be an end. This was a very impressive thing to do in a PhD.
Shortly after, in July 1965, the 23-year-old Dr. Stephen Hawking married Jane Wilde. He'd got himself a job as a research fellow at the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics at Cambridge, and the newlyweds moved into a tiny house close to the university.
It wasn't a terribly difficult decision to take, to marry Stephen, because at that time, every day one read reports in the newspapers that nuclear war was likely to break out in the next year or two. People were saying they weren't going to have children because there was going to be a nuclear war. And the fact that Stephen had been diagnosed as only having a couple of years to live didn't really seem to be very much different from the situation that was facing the rest of us anyhow. He really was in a rather pathetic state. I think he'd lost the will to live, or he was very confused, certainly. And I think gradually, together, we realised that we could do something.
2 years later, against all expectation, they had their first child, Robert.
He and we have a great deal to thank Jane for, because not many people would have agreed to have children with Stephen. And nobody expected it, because he was to be dead in 2 years. And it was more than 2 years before Robert was born.
Although Stephen seemed to be cheating death, the disease was making insidious progress. By the time their second child, Lucy, was born in 1970, Stephen was confined to a wheelchair.
And he just refused to die. Well, I think Jane was really convinced that, she could cure him. And I suppose in a way she certainly inspired him.
The deterioration of Hawking's body didn't stop him making another scientific breakthrough. At that time, black holes were thought to be bottomless pits, with gravity so strong that nothing, not even light, could escape from them. But Hawking proved this was not the whole story. Something was escaping.
The simplest way to think about this is to think in terms of little particles just outside the edge of the black hole, the horizon it's sometimes called. And what we know is that gravity, the energy of gravity, is so strong outside a black hole that it can be turned into particles from Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. But the laws of quantum mechanics tell you you can't make one particle, you have to make pairs. And if they're just outside the black hole, one of them can fall into the black hole and heads down towards the famous singularity, but the other one can scoot off into space and disappear out into the universe at large. Now, it's carrying with it some of the energy that came from the black hole, and because E equals mc squared, it's carrying some of the mass of the black hole. So the black hole, according to this image, gets smaller and smaller until eventually it becomes too small to be a black hole and explodes, and it's always radiating away these particles, which are the Hawking radiation.
This radical new idea, now known as Hawking radiation, caused a sensation in the physics community. It was a small step on the road to finding the holy grail of physics, the unified theory. Einstein searched for it. Hawking is still searching for it. A single law that would explain how the whole universe works. As a first stage in unlocking it, physicists must combine the two laws that explain our universe: relativity, describing the very large, time, space and gravity, and quantum mechanics, describing the very small, atoms and molecules. These two theories are usually quite distinct, but Hawking radiation showed that at the edge of a black hole, they do work together.
Linking different ideas in physics is an important thing because people want to have this ultimate theory, the theory of everything, the ultimate answer. Starting from the Big Bang, you could, in principle, they hope, explain everything that's happened since in this mathematical way using equations. You could predict the existence of stars and planets and people by knowing what happened in the Big Bang.
Hawking radiation also got him noticed beyond the narrow world of physics. In the late 1970s, black holes were sexy. People latched onto Hawking as the guru who could explain the mysteries of the universe. He began appearing in newspapers and on television. His physical appearance and the way he talked about big ideas in a witty and accessible way made him unforgettable, even though he had to use a student to interpret his failing speech.
You wouldn't see anything special if you passed inside the black hole. But once you pass a certain critical point,
Then
you'd never be able to get out again, no matter how much rocket power you used.
Stephen was very lucky in being the right person in the right place at the right time. Science, in some way, has become the new religion, that people are looking for ultimate truths. They'd lost God, and they were looking for something to replace God, and they hit on cosmology and black holes in the universe, and then they found a person who could represent the entire community of cosmology and astrophysics and so on to them.
We all came out of a singularity. The Big Bang singularity at the beginning of the universe. So it wouldn't be that unnatural if we all ended up in another singularity. You could say dust to dust and ashes to ashes and singularity to singularity.
For years, the Hawkings managed without nurses, just Jane, his secretary, and students caring for him on a rota. But now, with a third child, Timothy, the family was under increasing pressure. Hawking's motor neurone disease was atypical in that its progress was so unpredictable. He had already exceeded all expectations for his survival by more than 20 years. But in 1985, on a working trip to Geneva, Hawking caught pneumonia, something that frequently kills people in his condition. He was on a life support machine, unable to breathe unaided. To save him, his wife Jane gave permission for a tracheotomy operation, which would allow him to breathe through a hole in his windpipe. But he would pay a high price. Although at first he didn't realize it, the surgery that had saved his life meant he would never speak again. Hawking faced a future essentially trapped inside his body, barely able to convey even his most basic needs.
When I had my tracheotomy operation in 1985 and lost my voice, I thought at first that I might get it back eventually. But in the meantime, I desperately needed a way to communicate. I couldn't write or use a keyboard. All I could do was raise my eyebrows when someone pointed to letters on an alphabet card.
And he was furious, you know. He was very furious indeed, because now he couldn't talk at all. So they were communicating with him, partly by his eyebrows, very communicative eyebrows he's got, and partly by a sort of board where you say, is this the right one? And very, very slow means of communication.
To while away the long hospital hours, Hawking's friends and students read to him from whatever newspapers and books came to hand.
I remember this particular chapter. It involved one of the characters going into a sort of a sex club or something and watching some pornographic movie. I remember saying to Stephen, Stephen, I don't know that I should be reading this in front of all the nurses here. Do you really want me to carry on? And I remember Stephen sort of gave a little mischievous grin and sort of nodded his head, and his eyes sort of regained their sparkle. And I always think to myself, that was the point when I knew Stephen was going to make a recovery.
As he was getting better, he was sent a software package from America that allowed him to operate his computer using a single switch. When connected to a voice synthesizer, it let him speak at about 15 words per minute, 10 times slower than normal speech. Hawking could now communicate more clearly than he had done for years, but in a voice robbed of personal expression.
When he first had to start using a computer, it must have been very distressing, and I think it was with some reluctance. But the fact is that I think realistically, in a way, it may have been a blessing, because by that time his voice was so weak, even before he'd been ill, that he was having to repeat statements so many times in order to be understood, even by his close friends and associates.
Ironically, the electronic voice that showed no human emotion was to give Hawking his first chance to build a relationship with his younger son, Timothy.
For the first 5 or so years of my life, I didn't really get to know him as a person, just because I couldn't understand what he was saying. I knew he was my dad, but never really bonded with him at all. And I could actually start to speak to him when he got the voice box. We managed to build up a bit of a relationship from then on. You know, he'd take me to buy ice creams, and we'd play Monopoly together. It's just ironic that it was through the voice of someone else that enabled me to build up a relationship with him. When I was 6, I was actually able to use the voice on the computer we had at home. And, of course, at that age it's great to type out all rude words, swear words, etc., and then speak them off, because I knew I'd never hear my dad saying them, so wanted to see what they sounded like. But I felt bad a few years later because, I was sort of playing with his identity in some way.
Tim's childhood games also revealed another unexpected benefit of Hawking's new voice. People found it fascinating.
The first scientific description of time was given in 1689 by Sir Isaac Newton, who held the legation chair at Cambridge that I now occupy, though it wasn't electrically operated in his time.
Hawking himself was already memorable, but his synthesized voice made him unforgettable. His brush with death meant he now needed round-the-clock nursing, which the family couldn't afford. Jane got funding from several charitable organizations, but Hawking wanted to find a better way to provide for his family's future. He already had a plan. Just before he caught pneumonia, he'd signed a contract to write a popular book on the universe. With his computerized voice now making it easier to communicate, he resumed work on the manuscript.
I asked him about this book. I gathered it was supposed to be a sort of popular book. And I said, "Are you writing this with the Cambridge University Press?" And he said, "Good heavens, no. You're doing this to make money."
The Newton theory, time was absolute and marched on relentlessly.
Television had already given Hawking a taste of fame. He knew the public was interested in him and his universe, and believed that a book written by him and packaged in the right way could sell to a very wide audience.
Theory of relativity in 1915.
I think he knew how he was going to get a bestseller. I think his management of A Brief History was very much a measure of Stephen. I mean, he knew who to use and how to get that book out.
Every publisher had to submit a letter along with their offer indicating what their publishing plan was going to be. So I wrote this letter, and in the letter, one of the things I said was that the publisher I was working for, Bantam Books, had very powerful distribution. They were very strong in putting the books out there, and that they would be able to put books, hardcover books, in places like airports, make them widely available. And little did I know that of all the sentences in this long letter, this seductive letter, it would be that sentence that Stephen would jump on. And he loved the idea of his book in airports.
Space and time were made dynamic by the Einstein equations, which described how they were curved and distorted by the matter and energy in the universe.
Despite the complex subject matter, Hawking did all he could to make the book accessible. Yet when it was nearing completion, he began to worry whether he'd gone too far and it might not be taken seriously enough.
The title that came with the manuscript originally was A Brief History of Time. Late in the process, we were really getting close to finally putting these books to press. I got a call from Stephen saying he'd been thinking about it. He was concerned that maybe A Brief History of Time was a bit too casual, irreverent, and that perhaps we should call this book A Short History of Time. And I felt that strongly that that was not the way to go. And I quickly dashed off a note to Stephen and said, A Brief History of Time makes me smile. And that carried the day.
The book was published in spring 1988 in a modest run of 40,000 copies. But when it was realized some of the picture captions were wrong, the publishers rushed to withdraw them from the shops.
The retailers then said, we can't, we'd love to, but they're gone. They have been sold. They're off the shelves. And Bantam, for the first time, got the sense of, wow, we're onto something major.
The publishers were onto something major. A Brief History of Time would go on to sell 25 million copies worldwide. For the Hawking family, it changed things forever.
For the first 7 or 8 years of my life, it was, very happy setup. But, the cracks only started to appear really around the time of the publication of the book.
By the late 1980s, Stephen Hawking seemed to have turned adversity to advantage. Against all odds, he'd survived motor neurone disease for more than 25 years. Now he'd written a bestseller. It seemed as if finally he and his family would reap the rewards of years of struggle.
We'd always got along before, but things, we hadn't been especially wealthy, or we'd managed to survive. But suddenly, things started to change, and I remember around that time that there was a Lego set that was cost about £100, and I thought that was fiendishly expensive, and I'd never have it. And the next thing I knew, my dad had bought it for me, and that was just about the time that the book was published. And so I knew that something was changing.
But it wasn't just the family's financial status that was changing. Hawking now needed round-the-clock nursing care. A constant stream of nurses worked a rota of shifts looking after him.
It just changed things completely. Had a lot of new people coming in to the house, wandering in and out. The front door was always open. And it started to unsettle the balance of the family. My brother Robert, he was starting to go off to university. My sister Lucy, she was involved in, getting more involved in school because she didn't feel that comfortable at home. I think my mum found it hard because nurses started treating our house as their own home, taking baths, helping themselves to food, and our sort of house was turning into a hospital. Suddenly, Dad seemed to become a lot more outgoing with people outside the house. He was starting to let his hair down in some ways. He started buying Beatles CDs and stuff, and having parties, and the fact he could also, of course, be more independent now that he had his nurses, and that actually made his life easier, which meant that he didn't really have to be with my mum 24 hours a day. So maybe that was just a reaction. He wanted to do his own thing after having been dependent on her for so long. It was probably then that rot was starting to set in as far as their relationship was concerned.
I'm not an appendage of Stephen, as I very much feel I am. When we go to some of these official gatherings, sometimes I'm not even introduced to people. I come along behind, and I don't really know who I'm speaking to. But with my friends, I'm just me, and that's just Jane. That's terribly important. It's terribly important for my self-respect, and terribly important for my survival, I think.
Yes, I think my mother did feel as though she'd been treated unfairly because she'd been marginalised, really. She was no longer playing the role of my dad's nurse, and also she wasn't really playing the role of his wife, because it was quite rare for them actually to go out together. And obviously if they did, it would involve taking an entourage with them as well. She just didn't seem to fit in anywhere, and I think that really made her question why she had spent so much of her life devoting herself to my dad.
I don't think I had any idea how things would turn out. It was very, very difficult to know what would happen. It was impossible to look into the future. You can't put the clock back, and history doesn't repeat itself. So you have to say that you took the right decision at the right time.
Eventually they drifted apart, and each of them found comfort in other relationships. Jane with a family friend, Jonathan, here pouring champagne at dinner. Stephen with one of his nurses, Elaine, using the telephone in his office. In 1995, they were finally divorced, and Hawking married Elaine. 2 years later, Jane married Jonathan. The Hawkings' extraordinary partnership had lasted for 25 years. But in the end, the stresses and strains of their situation had broken them apart. Though designed to be a bestseller, the phenomenal success of A Brief History of Time still took everyone by surprise. It was bought, though not necessarily read, by millions of people around the world. The film rights were snapped up, and a feature-length documentary was made, narrated by Hawking himself.
If we do discover a complete theory of the universe, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason. For then we would know the mind of God.
The way that Hawking spoke about the universe gave people a sense of its wonder and mystery. His voice and distinctive delivery only added to his aura.
Silence has enormous power. And then when you deal with Stephen, there are pauses. One tends to fill in those pauses with insecure thoughts. So what's he thinking of me? Is he going to respond? And that gives to Stephen even more power than he would ordinarily command, which is a great deal.
At first, people had to read the screen to see what I was saying. But about a year later, I got this voice. I have stuck with it, because I now identify myself with it. People sometimes poke fun by imitating it, but I regard that as a sign of success, and it has become my trademark.
For millions of years.
For advertisers, the Hawking brand was a dream. Triumph over adversity, intellect, integrity, and unforgettable presence.
We learned to talk. We learned to listen. Speech has allowed the communication of ideas, enabling human beings to work together.
I was reading, or pretending to read, this book, A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I couldn't understand a word of it, but it was trendy to think you could read it at the time. And he also had a programme on television to accompany this book. And we saw it, and there was this amazing voice.
The very fact that he talks like he does, I think, just lends that greater gravitas, I suppose, to the whole thing. But
because he is who he is, isn't it? I mean, he is the supreme thinker.
The fact that he spoke like he did, and the fact that he sat in a wheelchair, and that's the Stephen Hawking package. That's what you buy into.
Our greatest hopes could become reality in the future. With the technology at our disposal, the possibilities are unbounded. All we need to do is make sure we keep talking.
In a culture that worships beauty, Stephen is not classically beautiful. But when you look at him, what comes through is this intellect, this amazing intellect. And that seems to me to be a portal to what is intellect about? It's about the quest for knowledge. And what is that about? That's the quest for truth. And the notion is, or the feeling you get is that Stephen can somehow give you access to, or some portal to, the truth.
In his commercials, Hawking only ever talked about big ideas, not products.
For me, physics is about seeing further, better, and deeper.
Advertisers were simply riding on the back of an image of modern-day genius.
And from here, I can see forever.
It's a bit like the oracles of ancient times who had to be blind or something wrong with them, some severe physical disability, and this meant that they had magical powers. They could see the future and things like this. And so I think people tend to treat Stephen rather in this way because he has these disabilities. And so he has this, people think of him as an oracle for quite the wrong reasons. I mean, it has nothing to do with the reasons behind what he says.
The words brilliant and genius probably get used way too much, but my guest tonight deserves both of them. and more. Professor Stephen William Hawking is the greatest mind in physics since Albert Einstein.
Stephen Hawking! The world's smartest man.
What are you doing here?
I don't know which is the bigger disappointment. My failure to formulate a unified field theory, or you.
I don't like your tone.
If you are looking for trouble, you found it.
Yeah, just try me, you... Oh!
Like Einstein before him, Hawking has now moved far beyond the world of science to become an icon of popular culture. But though he may be the most famous physicist in the world, fellow scientists take a cooler, more objective view of his status as a genius.
There's no way that he's another Einstein. He's one of the best of the ordinary people, if you like. And to name somebody comparable, obviously Roger Penrose, that he did a lot of work with. Roger's just as bright and has done equally important work, but he's not idolised and feted.
I think the word great is a difficult one to apply to a scientist, and in my view it would really only apply to somebody who has really made a fundamental change in the way we view things, a fundamental new equation or something, which would apply to Einstein, certainly, or to Newton. Stephen hasn't quite done that.
Comparisons with Newton and Einstein are just media hype. Among physicists, I'm respected, I hope. But I'm just one of a number of people who have helped shape our modern view of the universe. We all need to know where we belong and where we came from. I fit the stereotype of a disabled genius in that I'm clearly disabled. But I'm not a genius like Einstein was.
Like Einstein, however, he is spending the last years of his life on a quest for the holy grail of physics, the theory of everything, a law that will explain everything in the universe. His childhood fascination with the way things work still dominates his thoughts. Next to that, the illness that appears to define him is irrelevant.
If I had the choice between finding the theory of everything and regaining my mobility, I would have to choose the theory of everything. It is that which has given my life purpose. All children ask questions. How do things work? Why are they the way they are? I'm just a child that has never grown up. I still keep asking these how and why questions. Occasionally, I find an answer. The universe began with a hot Big Bang. But will it go on forever? And if not, how will it end?